first panel this morning with the state of Dapp development. For those that don't know, Dapp is short for distributed application or decentralized application. So for our panel today, we've got 4 folks. All 4 of these individuals are building projects in the Dapp infrastructure and end user applications. I wanted to have for the panel, we wanted to have 2 people who are actually building end user applications and 2 people who are building the infrastructure that the applications use. The kind of goal of this panel this morning is to help folks understand, do these things work? Like, what's working, what's not working, kind of the state of this ecosystem. It's all very young and early, so we just wanted to help kind of offer people some color, our LP's color on the state of development of the ecosystem. So, gentlemen, welcome. Thank you all for coming by. If you could start off, just tell us, who you are, what you do.
Thank you, Kyle. So my name's Nadav, and I am the founder and CEO of Dharma. Dharma is a protocol for tokenized debt agreements that is currently built on top of the Ethereum blockchain, but hopefully in the future, blockchains will talk to each other and/or there'll be better options than what we have in the status quo. Yeah, we are actively building all across the stack from just base level Solidity smart contracts to libraries that wrap around them, as well as end user facing dapps with client side interfaces and things like that.
I'm Vinny Lingham. Okay, cool. I'm Vinny Lingham. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Civic. We're a identity platform built on blockchain using identity tokens. We were one of the first to go out last year in June. And I'm also a general partner at Multicoin Capital as well since December, working with Kyle and Tushar on the broader ecosystem.
Hey guys, I'm Matt Luongo. I'm the project lead of Keep. We are a privacy layer currently for Ethereum. We're planning on launching cross-chain. And so we are a Dapp infrastructure provider. So.
Yaniv, project lead at The Graph. We're a protocol for querying data off blockchains and storage networks. So if you're building a Dapp, you need to get data, and usually you need to filter, sort, get the data in a certain way. Today you'd have to build centralized indexing servers to fulfill that on blockchain like Ethereum. So with The Graph, we're building a decentralized protocol for you to get that data. It's much faster and also secure.
Awesome, guys. So let's kick it off. Let's start up, Nadav and Vinny with you guys. You two have got kind of the end user applications here. What are the things that are working really well for Dapp development for you guys today?
Oh man, it's a lot easier to complain than it is to talk about the things that are going well about it. I'd say that what's great about it is it's like the core user base of people that are interacting with dapps right now, like because the barrier to entry to using a dapp right now is so high, because like you kind of need to be a little bit technical, you kind of need to understand like what a blockchain is, you need to use like MetaMask, you need to use like you can't like come in like on a cold start. So because there is this kind of like high barrier to entry, I find that like the people that are actively using dapps right now tend to be kind of like the power user, like kind of like the canonical like early adopter. And so in a sense, it's a really nice user base because like they actually do provide really good feedback. They do like have a really strong understanding of what's going on under the hood. But obviously, like this has some disadvantages as well that we can talk about afterwards.
Yeah, I'd agree with most of that actually. I think what we're seeing the biggest hurdle is just use cases. So the large part of the industry is focused on capacity and how do we get to 1 million transactions per second or some crazy number. But like the basic question is, well, what apps need that sort of capacity? Where are we going to get the usage from? If the early adopter community, which is reasonably small, is just using it, we're talking maybe hundreds of thousands of users. Like the biggest applications in crypto today is trading, right? So all these exchanges have got millions of customers. But outside of that, there's no application I'm aware of, no Dapp that has millions of users using it. It's just the demand isn't there yet. Now we have all these visions of how people could use, for example, identity to do a million different things, going through border crossings and buying alcohol online, etc. But no one's actually using it, so the usage isn't there. So you've got a problem where I think the tech industry is focusing on capacity, but not actual implementation and usage.
Yeah, if we're going to start on the positives, I think it's the quality of the people working in the space. and the quality of the collaboration. I think everyone kind of knows the vision, knows that it's still like early, and so just being able to kind of work at that pace with those types of engineers, I think is the best part of the space right now.
So it sounds like overall things are wonky. Is it that like the development environments are immature? Is it the libraries aren't there? Some combination of the above?
Yes, to all of the above. Yeah, the current development stack for creating dapps is like a little bit of a nightmare. And it's getting better, and there's tons of really smart people working on it, and like I really don't want to like look a gift horse in the mouth with respect to like all of the like people who have been seriously building open source software like without any sort of like equity like upside for tools like Truffle and MetaMask and things like that. So like the community owes a huge debt to these people, but the tools are still very primitive, and we find that when we are trying to onboard people onto our team, engineers that come from like the web development world, like they are just shocked by how primitive everything is, by the sorts of like basic things that they need to roll themselves, or the sorts of basic issues that you just don't really encounter in like a day-to-day continuous development environment. And I think another big issue with the kind of state of dApp development right now is that the development cycles are extremely long, right? So in the world of web development, which most engineers in the Valley right now kind of like sort of hover around, you generally continuously deploy, right? You're gonna be shipping code like every day to a live site. Whereas in the world of dApp development, if you are doing anything that touches smart contracts or involves you building smart contracts, there's just like this huge development cycle where you need to like create the smart contracts. You then need to hire external security auditors to look over them for security vulnerabilities. And that market is like crazy inflated and super in demand right now. And so you'll end up in this sort of situation where you have these like old school like software box style development cycles where it takes you like 6 months to ship something. And so it's really problematic in terms of like how you can iterate quickly with that sort of cycle.
So Matt and Yaniv, for you guys are building infrastructure for other applications to use. You guys are interacting with a lot of application developers who are interested in using your tools. I think you guys are both kind of in a beta state-ish now. Can you talk to us about some of the teams building on top of your tools and kind of just the experiences they have in working with them?
Sure. So it's very early days, and we're talking about dApp development now, but one of the things that I'm thinking about as we work on Keep is right now we're talking about Ethereum dApp development, right? And a big focus of our team is actually launching cross-chain. So when you talk about the core development kind of suite that we have now and Truffle and the fact that you have to hire an external security auditor, you now multiply that by each chain you want to support. The tool set is totally fragmented between them. So if anything, I'd just like to say it's even worse than it sounds. So I think we're going to start seeing as some of these sort of like layer 1 and like 2.0 or 3.0 depending new chains launch, we're going to see some standards come about. WASM obviously has been a big focus across a lot of projects, and I think a lot of the tools that we're using today are going to have to either work with it or die. So yeah, and the other thing is, when I integrate with a partner on a web project, it's fantastic. We can spin up a staging environment. The two teams are working together. We're constantly pushing code, seeing who breaks what. But when I integrate with someone who's got a smart contract product, I'm going to ship them a spec and wait 3 to 6 months. So it's a very different experience, I think, for a lot of us in the Valley to work with these guys. And frankly, and I'm embarrassed to say this, but I'm actually not used to talking to dApp developers. So a lot of the people that I'm building for are also building for dApp developers. So we're sort of even further back in the stack. So I guess that's how loose the feedback loop is, that it's rare that I get to talk to you guys about actually building user-facing code.
Yeah, I think we're kind of at this point right now where building on top of a platform like Ethereum, your code is going to be a lot slower and a lot more expensive to run than on like AWS. right? So the number of use cases today are, things like financial applications, things where coordination, at a higher scale is worth that additional expense. And there are some interesting use cases, primarily financial. And so, we haven't announced any projects that we're working with yet, but a very common thing with all these projects is they have to build these centralized indexing servers, and that's where the graph can help to make it so that they can get to market faster. Nobody wants to build centralized infrastructure in this space. I think people are aligned on wanting to have a fully decentralized stack and all of the benefits that gives you. But today people are really cobbling together a lot of their own tools because the infrastructure is still so new.
So it sounds like a lot of challenges in infrastructure. Are you guys seeing teams like, for example, security audits, right? That's a great example, and it's kind of a bottleneck for everyone in the ecosystem. Are you seeing efforts to expedite that? I know there's projects like a QuantStamp. There might be others. Can you guys touch on, that seems like a big bottleneck. There are others. What are we seeing to happen to accelerate through these bottlenecks?
So I'm not going to be the full-blown formal verification guy, but I'm just going to dip my toe in. Right now, the stack that we use for Ethereum is really based around how can I convince a web developer that they should handle millions of dollars very casually. And that's, if that sounds like a recipe for disaster, it is. So a lot of this stuff, it's been fantastic in terms of convincing people to sort of come from their day jobs, now even from like Google and Facebook to work in crypto. But the sorts of things we're building are, they're financial applications, right? Even if we pretend that they're not, they are. And so we need tools that are for shipping software for sort of rockets and medical devices rather than web development. Anyway, sorry, I've gone off on a bit of a tangent here, but I guess what I'm trying to say is security audits are important, but we also need to do a lot more work up front to improve our development process, and that means verification.
Yeah, so for those, just to elaborate on that, because so when Matt's referring to, like formal verification, he's referring to literally mathematical techniques where you can take a smart contract and you can prove some like mathematical statements about it so that like you with certainty know that certain invariants are satisfied. And this is really common in the world of like aerospace or medical devices or anything where you don't want someone's like head to go into an MRI and for something to go wrong there. And so there's a lot of really, really awesome work that's going into that right now.
Yeah, and the formal verification can help a lot to prove certain properties about a system. A lot of these things though they break because of the game theoretic issues that you may have with a system that might be difficult to model mathematically. And so a lot of times, you do just have to, put something out, get real people to use it for a while before you can gain confidence that, everything kind of works as designed.
Slight counter though, most of the money is going to be like parity hacks, right? So most of the money is very low-hanging fruit, easy bugs that we could have prevented. Obviously, you're right. We don't know how people will behave in this new economy we're creating either.
So as you guys look out, obviously the tooling of the infrastructure is still pretty early. Development cycles are still slow. If you project out, call it 12 months from now, are things 10% better, 50% better? Like does it become possible to even like ship on a faster cadence? If we try and project 12 months out, like what does the state of the world look like for you guys to ship better, faster?
Well, I actually think it might get worse. I'm sorry to say that. So I think it might get better for one chain. But just talking to these companies launching more, some of them have better tooling stories, and some of them are just going to launch the chain without like a really compelling sort of developer experience. And so I think there's going to be a while where, if you look at the early internet, like there are browser wars, it's about to happen. We're about to sort of see it. And that meant like there wasn't JavaScript, it was you had to choose your competing platform that you were targeting. So I think we're going to see that for a little while. I do think that the tools on Ethereum have some momentum right now, and that's probably the chain's biggest quality in competition. So, anyway.
I am excited to see what comes out of platforms like Dfinity that Kyle talked about earlier. But on Ethereum, I think there are some really exciting advancements coming out. So I think we will see a lot of progress on like Plasma and sharding, and I think that those are some of the big things that we need before dapps can be usable for a much larger number of use cases. Right? If we can get the computation to be faster and cheaper, that really does open us up to a lot of interesting things we can do with dapps.
So there are a lot of problems with the operating system to smart contract platform analogy, but there are some valid parts of that analogy that hold over, things like attracting developers and building on a stack and those kinds of things. We think about where we are today as kind of like the early 80s in terms of the OS environment, where there was a huge OS war. There was like 20 OSs that kind of launched in that time frame, and really only about 3 or so survived in a meaningful sense. We say that, we publicly articulate that, but you guys are building the applications. Are you seeing that happen? And then the follow-up from there is, are you seeing ways to abstract underlying platforms like an HTML kind of overlay or something equivalent?
So we're dealing with sort of speculatively building to be Dfinity compatible, as well as Ethereum, which is our first target chain. And the standards don't exist yet, and I don't think they will until the war has gone on for a little while. I think it'll be similar to OSs in that regard as well. But I guess all I can say is it's made it a little bit more difficult. I hope it gets better.
The graph is kind of cross-blockchain, so we can index data from lots of different data sources and make it available to dapps. And we do want to be this kind of interoperability layer where if you build on top of the graph, you don't have to care where the data comes from. It could be any blockchain, really. And so I think that can help to mitigate some of those issues, because I think we will see a lot of migration between different chains, interesting things happening at that lower level of the stack. And that experimentation should be able to happen. But if you're a Dapp user, what you want is to know that your data is portable, right? That you kind of have control over your private data, and that your Dapp is going to continue to work, and we would be a way to kind of insulate people from that change at the bottom layers.
That's a great point. We're the people who have to fix that, I guess. So as doom and gloom as it sounds, like if we do our jobs right, you will be able to use the graph and keep across these chains, and it should be smoother for Dapp developers and users. So
it sounds like, right, we're kind of rebuilding. If you think of HTML as an abstraction on top of the operating system, it seems like today, in a lot of ways, you guys as infrastructure providers are trying to kind of recreate your part of that stack to any application across any chain. Is that fair?
I mean, I think so. I think the stack analogy only goes so far, but when we're looking at storage and we're looking at data, we're looking at sort of like private computation and AWS alternatives. Yeah.
All right. So turn to you guys, Nadav and Vinny. You guys are building end user applications. You're, I think, today primarily on Ethereum, and certainly you're exploring other chains. If you guys think about porting to other chains right now, what are the kinds of barriers you're seeing to support that? Because obviously it seems like we're going to have a lot of chains, at least in the medium term, and so you're probably going to want to work across them. Right? What are you concerned about as project leads?
Yeah, so we actually gave this a decent amount of concerted thought. So the good news is that there's a loose network effect around the EVM right now, I'd say, where the EVM...
Could you clarify the EVM?
Yeah, the EVM is the Ethereum virtual machine. So you can kind of think of it as this kind of like abstraction layer on top of which smart contracts sit. So like in theory, is Dfinity EVM compatible? I think
originally it was EVM. I don't think they're still there.
I think they dropped it.
Yeah,
they dropped it. Okay. Well, walking through that thought experiment, I mean, EOS is EOS EVM compatible? Wasn't. Okay. Well, so like the whole idea here is that like if you have a common compile target, then theoretically my smart contracts that are on top of the Ethereum blockchain will be like just as easily runnable on the EOS or originally Dfinity blockchains, and like that's great. But I think that the bottleneck here actually happens at the wallet level. So like right now, like the client side wallets that exist are like primarily optimized for Ethereum, and I don't think there's any project right now that's working on a wallet that's kind of like agnostic across chains and just kind of like abstracts that layer away from you. And so like it's right now, like I'd say the bigger bottleneck is like literally just like on the UX level, is that like users would inherently be bifurcated just in terms of like whether they're using MetaMask or using MyCrypto or whatever other wallet.
So for us, when we started building the company in 2015, I think Ethereum barely even launched, or even though they were launched. So we designed the entire architecture on Bitcoin. And at the time, we didn't see capacity constraints coming in. The block size debate was obviously a big issue, but we expected that the block size would be raised. But we got to a point last year where the fees are $50 a transaction. I mean, it was impossible for us to run the business on Bitcoin. We were spending half a BTC a day on transactions, just fees, and it kind of got a little bit nuts. And so our token sits on Ethereum. It's an ERC20 token, and we're expecting to port it to RSK, but that still hasn't gone into production yet. So it's held us back. So the good thing is we're kind of spoiled for choice right now, because in all this time of like trying to deal with scaling on Bitcoin, etc., there's a lot of progress that's been made on other chains. You've got obviously EOS, Ethereum's made a lot of progress as well, and so it's a lot of work as a company that's built on one chain to move from one chain to another. So in the interim, we basically used Bitcoin Cash as effectively a backup chain, because the code base is almost identical to Bitcoin, and we could have lower fees, and there's no transaction sort of concerns right now. But that's not going to be the final solution. That's just a kind of interim one until we figure out. The ability to switch between chains is actually very, very important, or at least have. Because we don't know where things are going to be in 3 or 5 or 7 or 10 years' time. And if we're doing ID verifications and putting hashes on a blockchain and anchoring user data to a blockchain, it's important that it's portable at some point. Otherwise, we're just creating legacy, which is going to be hard to move. We don't have an answer yet, because, again, we're waiting for all these solutions, infrastructure players to mature a bit more, so we have a good visibility on at least who the winner is in the space, or at least one of the top 2 or 3, which we know will make it, and make it easier for us to be more portable. But for the volumes we're doing right now, because the market's still very nascent, especially we're focusing on the consumer side of it. It's still nascent, so it's okay that we can run on Bitcoin or Bitcoin Cash in the interim and work with those two. But once there's a real need and there's a real infrastructure that's built up, I'd say 6 to 12 months we'll have better visibility. I mean, EOS is launching June. We want to see how that plays out. And there's a lot of other good projects in the works. So, I don't know whether we've looked at some of the other investments that we've done at the fund, and keeping a good eye on where these platforms play out it's not just about throughput. There's a lot of other considerations in choosing a chain. Originally we chose Bitcoin because of censorship resistance, the ability to have nodes in every single country in the world. No government can sort of take your identity data or take the hashes, etc. It's very decentralized. The downside is when it gets to $50 a transaction, it's uneconomical. So it's the flip side.
I'd be interested to hear actually what you guys think about the underlying tokens network effect and its impact on you, right? So clearly the other thing Ethereum has going for it is a lot of people have Ethereum. And if you need to have Ethereum to use your consumer app, I feel like that's maybe the first step in the funnel you got to get through.
I'll just point out that Civic doesn't require users to use a token. So it's literally for the B2B transactions on the back end. The consumers will use the applications to do ID verification, and whoever's verifying or sending data on the back end, that's where the tokens get interchanged. So by design, we don't think that you can have a mass market consumer product right now where consumers are required to buy a token to use it. It would be very limited to the crypto community, which is not, by definition, mass market.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you pointed out a very real bottleneck here, which is that basically if you want to use a Ethereum Dapp right now, you need to have ETH in order to pay for gas fees, unless you take a sort of construction like what Civic has taken, where instead you have essentially external providers doing that on your behalf. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's not a good answer there. It's it's a problem.
I mean, for us, if we had an identity, we're launching our marketplace in Q3. The sort of terminal number of companies, governments, etc., doing ID verification on the back end is probably less than 1 million, right? So it's not going to be that many, and so getting them to use crypto, you sign up. We're going to make it really easy. You can deposit USD in the account, and in the back end, it'll just buy using an API crypto and do the exchanges. So there's no need for companies or to even own the crypto. They can run on whatever currency they want. Again, because it's powered by the tokens on the back end, so that's the beauty of the system. But the more you can obfuscate that and make it just sort of make it easy for people who are not in the crypto world to digest. Okay, this is the product. This is how it works. This is the value. the fact that it runs on crypto on the back end is kind of secondary.
And it's a good point that there are kind of network effects around it. It's a nice thing that there's all this speculation happening, right? Because these are all potential users for dapps that are getting ready now that are maybe just buying in. Every time there's a bull market and you see there's 200,000 people, whatever, creating exchange accounts a day, those are all potential users. And as soon as the dapps are ready, they'll be there.
What are you guys all what are you all most excited about, over the next 12 months as developers, not as investors, but as people who are building stuff?
I think the most exciting thing for me in this whole market is when I tell people, try to explain to people outside the crypto industry about what crypto is about, one of the analogies I use is I said, look, it's basically, think of thousands and thousands of experiments being run. There's 3,500, 4,000, 5,000 crypto companies, and it's all funded by a speculative bubble, call it that for now, because we don't know which projects are going to win and which are not going to win. But at least we're trying different ways to progress as a society, right? So 90% of these things can fail, and if we learn from experience, like the .com era, where 95% fails, the 5 big winners become bigger than what the bubble was, right? In terms of market caps over time, and the value to society, to some extent, is pretty great, and we move forward. And to have all these experiments running concurrently, like worldwide, and competing this is a scale that is unprecedented. So it doesn't matter that it is a bubble. It doesn't matter that it's speculative. We have to at least believe in the future of the technology that we're building that the winners will pay for the losers.
Another thing I would say is that there's so many people who did token sales during kind of the mania and who had raised either in public or private markets when this all kind of started blowing up, and a lot of that is froth, and a lot of those people aren't going to ship anything. And the exciting thing about these coming months right now is that you're kind of going to start to see the people you're going to see that separation emerge between the people who are actually going to be shipping protocols and projects versus the people who just kind of raised and are going to have one-off little shipping dates and things like that for a long time.
And a couple of Lambos.
So that's the question. What you guys? I get speculative mania, good things come of it. What are you guys actually excited building-wise in the next 12 months?
Do you want names of projects?
It can be projects, it can be tools, it can be what are you guys like? You wake up and you're like, man, I can't wait until X happens.
So I'm really excited about off-chain computation. I think, we all like to talk about scale, but I also think there's a lot of interesting economic work that's being done in that space. I think we're going to be testing a lot of the assumptions we've made around proof of stake. So we keep talking about different consensus mechanisms, but there's just some economic assumptions around, people will say skin in the game, that are just totally untested in the real world. And so I'm really excited to see some of that. I also think, I guess I'm going to be the first one to say this. I think at this event, crypto economics is a new field, right? And we don't really have principles that we can stand by yet. And so I think proof of stake is going to be a great experiment. And I think that even if proof of stake doesn't launch in the next 12 months on Ethereum, we're going to see it on some of these new chains and some of these other staking projects. So I'd really like to know if it works, since we're also a staking project.
On that note, if we're talking about kind of the new epochal technologies that are coming out in this space, I'm really excited to see all the interchain interoperability stuff hit market. As far as I've understood, Cosmos is pretty close to shipping, I think if that works well, that really, really changes the whole game. Because all of a sudden, you really, right now, the assumptions we've been making about our application is that it lives in the Ethereum address space, and as soon as that kind of bridge gets opened up, that changes everything. So that's really, really exciting.
For me, I'm watching Plasma pretty closely, so I'm excited to see what kind of Plasma chains come out, who runs them, right? How things get divvied up between different chains. That's what I'm going to be watching.
Just for clarity, I was listening to Carl's podcast he did the other day. It sounds like our early Plasma chains will be on the next quarter or so. So pretty close.
Mm-hmm.
That's correct.
I'm pretty excited about IPFS and Filecoin, the launch that I think hopefully later this year. I think like if you look at what happened with Amazon yesterday in the news and how they're trying to censor, the web. Like if you think about how important it is to have like censorship resistance in data, like I think they moved Wikipedia onto IPFS, so you can actually anywhere in the world you can literally access it, and it can't be censored. And I think that's important for us. I think if you want to build decentralized applications and give power to the people on a global scale, you can't have a situation where all our data is sitting in Amazon and they're the gatekeeper. Because that's like, now we're going back to step one again. So I think that, for me, that's an important milestone for us.
Vinny, if you could add just what is IPFS, what is Filecoin, and what happened with Wikipedia, just give some clarity here.
Well, so I think in what happened with, I'll start with what is IPFS. So IPFS basically is, the simplest way to explain it was, if you look at your code on an HTML page and you see the references to files, these files are, the URL reference is normally on a server, so it'll point to a server, it resolves to DNS, it knows where the server is. With IPFS, effectively, those files don't sit on a particular server. They are effectively sharded and distributed wherever on the network would be the closest node to you that has one. So, for example, this has more application in markets like Africa, etc., where it's like 21 hops to get to a file in North America, where the guy next to you could have just used that file 5 minutes ago, or be storing it on his machine. So why not just take it one hop away and save the round trip, etc. So, but the smart thing that they've done with IPFS is they've created you effectively have indexes, and you have for what it's called, but it's a method for
distributed HTML.
Yeah, so exactly.
Yeah,
so
the routing for the content.
Exactly. So, and then you can, if you're in a country like the US, you can subscribe to a list which makes sure that you don't pull things like illegal material content. But every country's got different rules and what's permissible, what isn't. But the point is, you don't have to listen to that. You could also just bypass all that and go torrent it and get the data elsewhere. So the key thing is that they've built a network where you can have good actors and bad actors all playing in the same space, but the censorship is really up to you, the user, and whatever node you want to follow. So it speeds up content delivery on a global scale, makes it a lot cheaper, it makes it censorship resistant, and then what Filecoin effectively is kind of like the billing mechanism that sits on top of IPFS, where you can share your hard drive space, and you can store files for other people and store on the network, and you earn file coins when you provide the storage and people use the files, etc. So so what they've done with I'm trying to do this as quickly as possible, so I'm skipping things, but what they did with Wikipedia is Wikipedia was banned, I think it was in Turkey last year, and so they just blocked Wikipedia, and then they basically copied the entire Wikipedia onto IPFS, and if you're in Turkey, now you could actually route through there and get those files without having to deal with the local internet sort of blockage of that URL, because the data doesn't sit on a server anymore. It's just distributed through all these sharded files, encrypted, etc., all over the web. So that's very powerful. And that's a short, 2-minute version. And that's why I'm really excited about what Filecoin offers. It's not just about the censorship resistance, but just like I'm from South Africa, so being in a place like Africa and having internet access there, and especially in remote places, it's very slow. And when I go home to visit family or travel for business, whatever, and I'm in Johannesburg, it's painful being online, because literally the content I want is sitting on a server in San Francisco. It's a 250 millisecond lag just to get data on every single call to every server. Basically, it's painful. And so having files locally through a different sort of distribution system would be much better. And it's a huge improvement over the current way the internet's built, where files are on servers in locations versus being distributed.
Filecoin's an interesting example of how people are doing development in the space right now, where IPFS is out and it works today, and almost every DApp that we talk to is using IPFS in some kind of way. Without Filecoin, there's no way to actually ensure that the files are really being available. And so it just shows how people are building on top of technology that's still only kind of half available, and we're all just kind of waiting for the rest of the pieces to come together before you can really use it in a production environment in a way that you can trust.
Riffing on that, back to the tools point, I was talking to one of the guys at Protocol Labs the other day, And some of our engineers had opened a pull request on some libp2p thing. And we asked, oh, hey, what are the plans for this library? And they said, well, we actually have 6 other projects that are all building on this right now that are asking the same thing. So they're sort of quietly getting consensus among these projects to build these tools.
So we're wrapping up on our questions. We'll open up for Q&A here in a second. It sounds like the IPFS and Filecoin are super exciting. Plasma chains, and for those that don't know, Plasma is a way to allow for limited scaling within Ethereum, like orders of magnitude of scaling. Those are some of the key things, and those are both pretty soon this year kind of developments. So with that, we'll open it up. Questions. I know this was a little bit technical panel. I promise nothing else will be this technical for the rest of the day. But I'll open up for questions, and Miles can run mic. Ali, you're a little technical. You can give us a question.
Well, I was only here for the last 5 minutes.
What do you think is the most important bottleneck to get a DApp to achieve scale with respect to number of users and an amount of engagement?
I don't know if this is a contrarian opinion or not, but I honestly think UX is like way understated right now in this space. Like I tried, I was back home the other day, and I tried to teach my dad how to use our application, and I think we have a pretty solid UX personally, but just the whole process of like, okay, you need to install this Chrome extension. It's called MetaMask. And now that you have sent this transaction, or you've clicked this button and confirmed the transaction, there's actually a chance that the blockchain might roll that back, but just maybe. So all these crazy weird UX things that surround using a blockchain application are like things that like I think people will figure out, and we're seeing these things improve. But it's just like right now we are not in any way at a point where like dApps are usable by average internet users.
Yeah, I would agree on that. I mean, we put a lot of effort into design and UX and at Civic. There's really there's a fork in the road, right? So what are the applications for dApps that replace existing behaviors and needs, and what are the new applications for dApps that are just totally new that you can't compare to what's been out there today? And so you take the path of replacing certain services with dApps. That UX has to be significantly better, and the value to the user has to be significantly better to change behaviors. So when you're changing behaviors, typically the value proposition to the user, I saw studies where it's like 7 times more value in some quantifiable way to the user for them to change what they do with what they do. So either it's a massive saving in cost, or it's a lot faster, or achieve their goals in a better way. So it's really hard to change existing behaviors. Okay. Now, with what dApps offer us in terms of rethinking the way the world should work or can work, and solving problems that haven't been solved in the other ways out there, and other products out there, that's the big opportunity, I think. So instead of trying to convert people and changing behaviors, what are the new behaviors you can create? Like, how would you think about buying like alcohol at a vending machine, for example? Like, what are the new things you can do that you can't do today? And what doors does that open up for you?
I agree with the UX. I think the chance that mainstream users use dApps where you have to like submit a transaction every time you want to perform an action in the app, I think is like close to zero. Something that people are actively working on is like payment channels, and I think that would be a lot more approachable to people if you can basically like load up some money into a channel, and then an app can submit operations for you without you having to manually approve every one. I think things like that would be really important for things like this to go mainstream.
Saw some hands up.
So, just just with the example of asking the questions and not having someone ask just because it was slightly more technical. We live in these little confirmation bias bubbles. And I think one of the big challenges is like the amazing work that you're doing, thinking about your question of getting to the end users, UX obviously is one aspect of it, but getting the translation out to outside of our confirmation bias bubbles, the rest of the world. What is the effort that outside of the events, what is the effort that you're doing as individual projects or individual companies to be able to connect with that mainstream audience in terms of not just the narrative or the messaging, but do you actually have people that you're hiring that can help bridge that gap and create outreach?
So I'll actually go for it. I'm not working on a consumer project, so it's strange that I'm going to try to answer this. But I think something that we're seeing lately in crypto is this emerging importance of community management and understanding that when you launch, for example, like a token network or a decentralized project, that it is bigger and it is outside your company, and it's not just how can we market to people and broadcast to people, but also how can we get them engaged and participate more meaningfully. So I think I had a discussion with a friend the other day where we were talking about how underpaid community managers are in the crypto space. And I think we're going to sort of see a trend to the folks who can take this incredibly technical, ideological stuff that we've got going on and actually make it relatable. I think there's going to be a premium for that talent.
Almost the Obama anger translator.
Mm-hmm.
The equivalent for this.
I think that's going to become really important. I think we might be a little bit early for some of that. It's like if you've got a great product that you want to launch, you maybe don't want to do the launch before you've got a really smooth onboarding process. And I think getting that onboarding process smooth is going to take us maybe 12 to 24 months. And so I think for now it's good that, like someone mentioned earlier, it's a lot of power users, right, that are willing to deal with some of those things. And I think once we get the infrastructure ready, once it's really competitive with traditional applications, then we can start to do kind of like the broader outreach.
I think it's probably time for our last question.
Good morning. My name is Jacob Mullins. A different slice on Amit's question is, in a market so rife with speculation, how are you thinking about incenting the right type of users, the long-term user as opposed to the short-term user?
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the rationale that we had in not pursuing a token sale or not necessarily having any. Yeah, I mean, basically, like there's a very common argument in the space that that token sales kind of incent you like these early adopters because not only are they incentivized to use your application, but in theory they have this upside incentive as an investor as well. And I think that like there is something to that idea, and like that's gonna somehow be the way that this space works in the future. But right now, the way that the market kind of works is that I think a lot of those people are less users and more so speculators. And I think that reflects in a lot of the usage behavior that you see from those sorts of users. And so that's kind of part of the rationale that we took in saying instead that we're just going to focus on building a product and just making it great.
Yeah, if you look at, we have a Telegram room with about 9,000 people called Civic Network Supporters. I think the biggest criticism that I get from the room is that we don't do enough marketing and hyping and announcements and pumping of the price. And so, and I tell people, I say, look.
Thank you, Vinny.
No, it's exactly the point, though. So the people in those rooms are speculators. They want the price to go up just so they can offload their tokens at a higher price. Like, why would we focus our time on that? Instead, we're focusing on building consumption and use cases and demand for the actual underlying product, because when the tokens are consumed, that effectively pulls them out of the market and creates, there's a better cycle for if they want to achieve what they want to achieve for the long term, it's better to have a real demand-based product that's not, the price isn't driven by speculation, it's driven by utility and usage. And so that's what I try to educate people on, is that usage and utility is way more important than the short-term speculation cycles.
But there's a funny thing, right, that happens where you guys did this fairly open token sale, and that's not a requirement. In fact, most of us are afraid of that currently with today's regulatory environment. But no project has to give its tokens out. Like if you look at MakerDAO or some of these folks who really recognize that these tokens are an important governance sort of component to what we're doing, they knew, like, we don't bring in people who aren't actually interested in the long-term success of the project. So I think that's sort of the shift that regulators have made us kind of take. But anyway, for us, we've just, and anytime someone says when Lambo, they're kicked out of our Slack. Like, that's it. And so just like sort of a no tolerance policy for that sort of behavior. And then the other thing we're doing is, for our token distribution, we're looking at how can we make sure that developers get this in their hands first rather than speculators.
Well, Matt, we have a contractual agreement to get our token, so I'm going to go on your Telegram and talk about talk about Lambos all day. Awesome. Well, guys, thanks so much for coming by. We're out of time for this session. And yeah.